Hi, this is Dr. P, and this is going to be quite a long screencast because I'm talking about the game Diplomacy. We're going to deconstruct it. And I think this is one of the greatest games ever made, so as you might expect, I'll talk a lot about it. Now, what's a deconstruction? We're trying to discern the inner workings of a game. What makes the game work or not work from a design point of view? And the purpose is to help designers understand how it works and why it is successful or not, so they can apply those lessons to their own games. I have a lot of history with this game. It was my favorite game from 1970 to 1975. I played a lot by mail, and there was no email then, so the games took several years, and I was quite successful. I published 2 diplomacy fanzines. These were the days of printed fanzines, Mimeo or Ditto. Wrote quite a few articles about the game. My series of articles about playing the game well is still up on the Avalon Hill website 40-some years later, I guess, about 40 years. And it's cited on the Board Game Geek page for Diplomacy. I also designed a lot of variations of Diplomacy, dip variants they're usually called. And to this day, I'm probably the most prolific designer of published Diplomacy variants, though I gave it up when I started to design standalone games in the late 70s. So I have a lot of history with this game. So what is it? It's a 7-player game, though there are many variants for other than 7. And of course 7 players is very unusual to start with. It depicts, perhaps roughly represents, World War I and the era before it. It's a very long game when played to a conclusion, which is often a draw, 4 to 8 hours. Almost all the activity is interaction amongst the players, especially via secret negotiation. And it's the secret negotiation that makes the game and also makes it a long game. Moreover, it's a zero-sum game. The only way to gain something is to take it from someone else. And that's part of what makes it such a cutthroat game. There's no way to progress without regressing somebody else. It's a heavily psychological game, because much of it goes on in the players' minds, though there is a tactical system and a strategic system. Now, this is something that struck me only recently. It's actually a cooperative game. The Diplomacy is known as a cutthroat board game full of lies and deceit, but it is one of the most cooperative games in existence that can still produce a single winner, though often it doesn't. It's not like the standard co-op game, because it isn't the type of game where all the players win or none of them win. Also, you're not playing against the game. You're not playing against programmed instructions. Nonetheless, it's very cooperative because you can't go it alone. You have to work with other players to succeed because you're outnumbered 6 to 1, at least at first. Even more important, one of the fundamental mechanics of the game is a support order that lets you actively assist another player or be assisted, and that's a rarity in games. And partly that's possible because we have simultaneous movement adjudication in Diplomacy, which is also quite rare in tabletop games. So we have a game where strategy, in the sense of military grand strategy, is very important. It's a game of negotiation, but you need to negotiate with the right objectives in mind. So understanding the strategy of the entire game is vital. A good strategist will beat a good tactician, again because you're outnumbered 6 to 1 at the game start. There are 7 players, but you only have 3 or 4 neighbors at the start of the game. Yet you have to see and try to influence the entire board for the entire game to maximize your chances to win. It is an epitome of strategy, in the sense both of military strategy and of strategy more generally, as you have to use your brain, your mind, to succeed. This is a conference map which the players have to take with them when they go off for secret negotiations, that shows the board of the game. And there are only 70-some areas on the board. There are only 2 kinds of units, armies and fleets. The fleets can go into coastal areas. And the tactical system, as I've said, involves simultaneous movement. There can't be more than 34 pieces, but players have to write an order for each of their pieces. It's possible to help another player in the tactical phase of the game as well as to hinder others. There's no overt chance in resolution of conflicts, no cards, no dice. But because it's simultaneous movement, sometimes there's guesswork. Sometimes there's yomi, reading the enemy's intentions. Of course, in the larger sense, yomi is very important in the strategy of the game, because if somebody's going to stab you in the back, you have to figure that out in time to do something about it. Now, I'm going to go through my 10 subsystems of all games and state what we see in diplomacy. The first one, model, theme, atmosphere, and so on, loosely represents World War I. Loosely. The 7 players are roughly equal in strength. We have 70-some areas on the board and only armies and fleets. Player interaction and number of players, 7 players, interaction via negotiation. Lying, even cheating, is encouraged in the rules in the spirit of Cold War and earlier diplomacy. Diplomacy was originally published in 1959, the same year as Risk in the United States. Objective victory conditions. Players need to control a majority of the 34 supply centers. So there is player elimination, but at the end of the game there may be 3, 4, or even more players, and often nobody can achieve a majority of the supply centers, and so you end up with a draw. Number 4 is data storage. Of course, there's an area board, armies and fleets in 7 colors, and you use a paper and pen for writing orders. The sequencing is a negotiation session followed by simultaneous orders and movement. Movement placement is 1 unit per area. Units move 1 area maximum in a turn. Fleets can occupy coastal provinces. And if you recall the board, the sea areas and the areas along the edges of the board are larger, so that you can move just as quickly around the board as through the center of the board to get to the other end. Information availability, only the player's intentions and his orders are hidden from the other players. Conflict resolution is simultaneous and deterministic. A majority wins. The economy is zero-sum, 34 centers. To gain a unit, you must take a center from somebody else. The user interface is a board game. Players writing their orders. They talk with other players, frequently in secret, leaving the table. So, I have some evaluation questions I try to use with a deconstruction. What is the essence or vision of the game? Negotiation followed by strategic and tactical action in a very rough representation of World War I that's diceless and uses simultaneous adjudication. Who is it marketed to? Hardcore psychological game players. It's kind of the opposite of chess. It's a really strange combination of poker and chess. It's poker psychologically, but retaining the determinism of chess. The player's primary activity is negotiating. What are the major challenges? Well, reading opponents' intentions while disguising yours is a great deal of it, and military grand strategy. The actions the players can take to overcome the challenges: they can negotiate offensively oriented alliances, negotiate non-aggression agreements, make war, make peace, expand, capturing supply centers with superior force or guile, and outthink the other players. As I said, there are lots and lots of variations of diplomacy. Part of the fascination with the game is its fascination with maps and with the shapes of things on maps. In other words, with geopolitics. And there may be, well, certainly are, hundreds of diplomacy variants, often with a new map, sometimes not. My apprenticeship in game design was partly with diplomacy variants. So, a summary. The game is a niche taste, but it's the epitome of this kind of game. Because of the nature of the game, those whose feelings are easily hurt should not play this game. It's an extreme example of a game where you have to earn what you get. And that's out of fashion these days. I regard it as one of the great games in the history of the world, and I rarely call a game great. It's instructive in how psychological game can be so different from poker, which is very much a psychological game, and also how a chess-like game can be so different from chess. Nowadays, the game is often played by email with programmed judges, and some variants are played by email as well. There are diplomacy conventions, but it's not that easy to get 7 people together to play diplomacy, especially because it takes so long. There are commercial, or have been commercial diplomacy playing video games, and they have been a disaster. Just horrible. So, it's a game at an extreme. Nearly 50 years after publication, it doesn't suit most modern tastes, but it still has lots of fans. Thanks for listening.